And thank you for joining us for the first webinar in our fall 2021 Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar series. My name is Virginia Rhodes. I'm the project director for the ARC Network. And we're very excited to host our latest cohort of the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program for today's webinar. This program empowers scholars to complete metasynthesis and meta-analysis of existing literature, to address critical issues relevant to equity in STEM. Now, before we introduce today's guests, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share that recording with registrants and post it to our ARC Network website and social media. We do regret to inform you that due to an emergency outside of our control, we'll be using Zoom's integrated live captioning. So to walk through some of the functions, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you will see a number of different menu options, including live transcript. Clicking on that little caret will reveal options to show or hide subtitles if you need so, and you can also view or hide the full transcript. Also hovering over the bottom in the center are options for Q&A and chat. So for the beginning of our webinar, you'll only be able to view chat messages from the ARC team, where we'll share links to resources as well as our feedback survey. And we'll open the chat for participants to share once we finish the prompted part of our discussion. And if you have any questions for the speakers, please add them to the Q&A, and you can also upvote questions that really resonate with you. Now, let's talking about the ARC Network. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholars program, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is built on works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folk experience. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's ADVANCE program, and the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN, serves as our home organization. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityinstem.org, where you can also join the community if you haven't done so already. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at ARC Equity in STEM, or using the hashtag Equity in STEM. Now, ARC Network's Community Engagement Manager, Stephanie Page, will briefly introduce our newest team member and get us started on today's discussion.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We are absolutely thrilled to welcome Bethany Farmer to the ARC team. Bethany serves as ARC Network's community librarian and brings over a decade's worth of expertise in library and information science. We are so excited to have Bethany on our team to enhance our community's experience with the ARC Network Research Library. To assist the ARC community in better accessing the work of our virtual visiting scholars, Bethany has created subfolders in the library, which will contain work authored by our scholars, along with resources that our scholars have curated. We are so thankful for Bethany being here, and we just had to take a moment to welcome her and introduce her to our community. So, we are also very excited to host our latest cohort of the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program today. Just to start, to remind you, if you have any questions for our speakers, please ask those questions through the Q&A, and you can also upvote questions that you want to hear asked and answered potentially. We will also open up the chat once we finish with our prompted part of the discussion. But now for introductions. Joining us today is Dr. Dawn Culpepper, who is the Associate Director and an Assistant Research Professor at the University of Maryland Advanced Program for Inclusive Excellence. Dawn's project applies intersectional perspectives to bystander intervention, training, and academic workplaces. Dr. Rodica Lisnic is a lecturer on race, class, and gender in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Arkansas. Rodica's meta-analyses will focus on persistence strategies of women of color in STEM. And Dr. Rachele Hendricks-Sturrup is the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy Research Director. Rachele's project will investigate gender and intersectionality as they pertain to industry-academia partnerships. Thank you so much to each of you for joining us. And let's get right to the first question. Can you share a bit more about the project you're working on as a virtual visiting scholar and share how your background shapes it? Can we start with you, Rachele?
Yes, thank you. I was looking for the mute button, as always. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here and to convene with the other virtual visiting scholars for this year. As you mentioned, my project focuses on industry academia partnerships and looking at those partnerships through an equity, whether that's gender and gender intersectionality lens. This topic is really important to me because as I moved along my STEM career, I realized that like most of us here, industry and academia have always been at odds. However, when they're able to work together and convene and discuss really important topics like policy or like even entrepreneurship, for example, cultivating entrepreneurship among academicians in STEM, working in that field, it always turned into something great. Really when the two industries are able to work together and also produce work products that are really meaningful, not just for the field, but also for the communities that are being served through the industry services being provided or products being provided, it really makes a big impact. And for academicians to have this sort of impact on their resumes makes a big difference for their careers overall. So a lot of my work involves convening folks from industry and academia, and I see a lot of great things happen from that, as I mentioned. So I'm really happy to conduct this research, particularly through an equity lens.
Wonderful. And as you were responding, and this always tends to happen, that you can kind of hear so much overlap between the scholars' work and their motivations in their work. I'd absolutely love to hear from Rodica, particularly with her interest in persistent strategies and how she's been, arrived at the place to focus on this topic. Rodica, can we hear from you next?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for the lovely introduction. I'd like to say how happy I am to meet all of you and to be part of this wonderful group of scholars. I'm very excited. So to answer this question, I started my journey in this research area when I was a graduate student, and I joined the research team at the University of Arkansas, and we wanted to analyze the effectiveness of the advanced program in supporting women faculty and in changing the institution. So at that time, we looked at the initiatives, early initiatives that were like in early 2000s and 2000 up to 2010, 2009. And we found out that the initiatives focused on women in general and the intersection of gender and race and the unique barriers that women of color experience were not taken into consideration at that time. And these findings kind of stirred my curiosity, and I wanted to continue this kind of research. And in my dissertation work, where I continued to focus on how women in faculty in STEM perceive the departmental practices and how those influence their success while getting tenure and promotion. So in my career, I have focused always on institutional practices, policies, and how those affect women's work outcomes. With this visiting scholar project, I'm taking a little bit of a different approach. I want to look at women's agency. I want to look at how women respond to the institutional policies and practices. I want to know how they respond to a work environment, but that is not conducive to their success. So, as we know from the theory of gendered and racialized organizations theory and intersectionality, women of color experience barriers of exclusion that are not experienced by men of color or white women in higher education, and in particular in STEM fields. STEM fields being a field which is more masculinized according to literature, and the white culture, white Anglo-Saxon ethnic culture is also predominant. So I've always been fascinated by this question: how do people react? How do they respond when there is adversity? And in particular, I've been studying all these barriers that women of color in STEM fields encounter on a regular basis. So I wanted to know, how do they react to that? Are they resilient? Are they breaking down? How do they navigate an inhospitable work environment? So there's literature that says that women of color use many strategies to persist. However, I want to know what these strategies are. I want to have a comprehensive picture. And I also would like to know how successful they are in overcoming these barriers that originate in gendered and racialized institutional and departmental practices. I also am very curious to find out whether these strategies are well balanced and support women of color as whole human beings, or whether these strategies support only the career aspect of it. So I found out there is some literature that talks about the fact that when faced with adversity, people engage in strategies that are one-dimensional. They only support their career and not the whole person. So I'm also very curious about whether there are inter-ethnic differences that women of color engage in. I'm looking at how I'm looking at 4 groups of women faculty: Black women, Latina, Indigenous, and Asian. So the idea is that cultural identity can influence the kind of strategies women faculty use. So, and I'm also focusing on both internal and external resources of persistence. On a personal level, as a minority faculty myself, I always seek to understand other minorities' experiences in academia. I'm a foreign-born faculty, a Moldovan woman who came to the United States as an adult. I came from an Eastern European nation, Moldova, which has been for a long time under Soviet Russia rule, and hence has become impoverished. So by understanding other minorities' experiences, I am trying to understand, have a better clarity of my own experiences. So that's on a personal level. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. And it's so incredible that I hope the audience feels what we feel. It's just that there's already this very clear layering even of Rachele and your interests. I would love to hear more from Dawn now. Do you mind sharing a bit of your focus for the project and how your background shapes it?
Yeah, thank you so much to the organizers and for everyone in attendance. I've been a beneficiary of the ARC Network's programs and resources over the years, so I'm really happy and excited to now be part of this group. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my own background in facilitating faculty development workshops on bystander intervention or allyship, and how this has really informed my research project. So, as the introduction said, I'm currently a faculty member at the University of Maryland Advanced program. And we run a host of kind of education and training initiatives aimed at enhancing equity in the faculty work environment, both engaging with faculty from historically marginalized groups, as well as engaging with academic leaders and other faculty who are interested in promoting equity-minded change. And about 5 years ago, we, like many other campuses with advanced programs, began experimenting with a program called TERP Allies. Terrapin is the mascot of the University of Maryland. And so we were really drawing inspiration from the work of folks like Stephanie Goodwin and places like the University of New Hampshire and Michigan and Florida International University, among others, who had used insights from Theater of the Oppressed and other interactive theater experiences to really think about how to engage faculty members as bystanders when they see or when they saw or observed instances of biases in their own academic workplace. And so the goal was to really think about how we could engage faculty who hold privileged identities and or who are in positions of power to mitigate or disrupt bias when they saw it occur. And I think one of the key ingredients to the success of many of these programs seems to be the focus on the concrete strategies that participants can use to mitigate bias, as opposed to reinforcing the inevitability of bias, which mirrors the kind of social science research that we've seen from folks like Davin and Kalev and many others. So we had a good amount of success with that program on our campus over the last 5 years. And then the pandemic happened and the protests for racial justice began. And I think that the national and campus conversations about what it means to be an ally and what it means to intervene when you see bias occur really started to change. And so as a facilitator of these workshops, I really started to think about two things. So one was that I really wanted to think about the ways that we could bring in more critical and more intersectional perspectives to this work. So for instance, drawing on the vast literature in areas like social justice education, social psychology, behavioral economics, and sociology, and really bringing insights from those disciplines to bear on how we think about faculty allyship, bystander interventions, and equity advocacy, so that we continue to focus on not just building individual skills, but also creating a conversation about structures and about systems and about changing them. And then the other thing that I really thought about was after doing many of these workshops, I had received constructive but critical comments from faculty members about the limitations of allyship. The reality is that a lot of biases are not microaggressions, they are macro. And also the need to really think about and acknowledge the way that intersectional identities kind of shape the bystander strategies that are available to people. So for instance, the differences in the ways in which a non-tenure track man of color might be able to intervene versus the way that a non-tenure track white woman might be able to, and how that might shape their experiences as they move forward with their colleagues. So with that background in mind, the goals of my project are to really understand how faculty bystander or allies programs have been constructed and the extent to which they acknowledge intersectional systems of power and oppression, and then concurrently dive into the literature from sociology, social psych, behavioral economics, public health, and social justice education to understand what we could be doing to better engage faculty members in this kind of work. And so I've begun by collecting the articles from faculty bystander interventions, many of which are from advanced colleagues across the country, and really started mapping out their foci. And then I plan to spend a lot of time in the disciplinary-based literature, kind of trying to understand lessons learned and things that we're not doing in the faculty space that we should be doing. And so I'm really excited about this project because it was something that I had wanted to do and thought about a lot about as I was doing workshops over the years. And so I think that there's a real potential to contribute not only to research, but directly to practice as well.
When you talk about contributing to both research and practice, it's kind of really helps me set up the next question. And it's incredible to think not only of the work in the context of the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program, which you all just described, but also like your full bodies of work. And it's just very clear that you're all motivated for change and you're motivated to drive change. But I wanted to hear, if I could, a little bit more about what aspects of your project are you most excited about exploring, and what are you hoping your project will illuminate about STEM equity research and practice? And can we start with you again, Rachele?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are many points or aspects of my project that I'm really excited about. I think, just over the years, I've followed and connected and had the privilege of, engaging with various women in STEM who have successfully navigated their academic careers and moved toward industry partnerships or industry enterprise endeavors that they are now leaders of, leaders in the field and also leaders within the company. So I'm really excited about exploring their journeys. Sometimes the journeys are great. Sometimes they start off great, but then they don't end up as such. There are some, examples of women out there who I can actually talk about too, that I noted even in my proposal. Dr. Deborah Kilpatrick, who's the CEO of Evidation Health, has, from what appears on the surface, to be a great career as a CEO of the company that she helped launch several years ago. And to date, she appears to enjoy great success in growing the company and also growing the field of generating patient-generated health data as an engineer by training from a technical university. She received her PhD. Now then looking at alternatively, looking at the experiences of the esteemed Dr. Timnit Gebru from Stanford University, who moved over into Google to do some work there. She faced, during her successful academic career, moving into now a successful industry career, she faced a lot of hardships within the company, so much that she experienced what she called gaslighting and bias in the workplace that ultimately drove her to leave the company. There was a lot of media attention to that story and really a lot of media attention focused on, not just the tension between industry and academia and objectivity and research, but also the tensions that women of color, again, looking at the intersectionality lens, the tensions that women of color tend to experience, not just in academia, but also as they navigate through industry. So there's a multi-pronged focus on this. And so I think that's probably the most exciting part about my project. And just having done some work or digging into the literature on the topic of industry, academia, collaborations and partnerships, I found that male academics are much more likely than female academics to collaborate with industry partners and find success. And really it's because, again, based on what the literature shows, female academics tend to have more disadvantages in their pursuits to collaborate outside of academia. And I think the examples that I just provided between Dr. Kilpatrick and Dr. Gebru show that sometimes they're disadvantaged if they're women of color. So versus, not a woman of color. So I think that's very telling. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. And then in addition to all of that, there's not a whole lot of empirical data out there capturing the experiences of academics moving from academic STEM to industry STEM from an equity focused standpoint. So again, what I'm excited about are the exploring the literature gaps. So what don't we know? Like, what should we be asking about this based on the journeys that we've heard from others? And how should the literature better capture these experiences from both a qualitative and a qualitative or quantitative standpoint? And as I perform my metasynthesis of the literature to identify some of the qualitative points that are important, how can we, as a next step, take that to more quantify these lived experiences so that way we can take action? So I'm hoping that my project will illuminate about STEM equity research and practice, essentially those literature gaps, the qualitative gaps that we need to know in order to better quantify the experiences of women and women of color navigating through industry and academia partnerships and collaborations.
I am speechless. Thank you so much for touching on that, because I think that it is absolutely, such a personal connection for those of us who traversed STEM and made decisions about what our next step would be when we chose to leave academia. And it really kind of calls to mind for me too, because you brought up these two amazing women and their experiences. And I'm thinking also immediately of Rodica's work and her focus on persistent strategies. So Rodica, do you mind going next to, respond to what you're excited about and what you're hoping to illuminate?
Yes, I'd like to. So I am very excited about understanding and highlighting this broad picture of what persistence looks like for women of color in STEM. I can tell you by starting reading some of these studies, ethnographies, there are so many stories about triumphs. There are so many stories about success, and I can see how these stories can be motivational for so many women, not just women in STEM. And these are stories about women's agency, and I would like to highlight that. So far, I have read success stories, to be honest, in the literature. We'll see how it goes from here, but so far it's a lot of success stories. And however, there is literature, non-STEM literature, that talks about all the mental toll that it takes to constantly think about ways to overcome obstacles and institutional barriers that stem from gendered and racialized practices. So I would like to think about that, and I would like to talk about that, depending on how the analysis goes. So we need to know a whole picture so that institutions can better understand the need for change, because we cannot rely only on the internal strength of women to be successful. The institution needs to be supportive. So I hope to highlight institutional resources that women of color use successfully, and that universities can leverage in order to expand those resources so that as many women of color as possible can use those. I'm also very excited to find out the differences in strategies based on the cultural identity. That's something that is understudied, and I'm looking forward to find out more about that. And of course, the main motivation here is that this study will contribute to retention of women of color in STEM.
Wow, I almost honestly fell over in my chair when you made the statement about relying on the internal fortitude of women. And it's such an incredible motivation, I think, for all of us, right, to begin to understand why equity, or I won't say begin to understand, but to continue to understand more deeply why our work is so incredible and why this focus and emphasis on equity is so incredible. And of course, I thought so much about bystander intervention training, Don, and how much of a critical avenue, because it also creates the space to begin to rely less on internal fortitude of marginalized folks. Do you mind giving your insights and thoughts on our question?
Of course. And I was thinking about similar things. So, you know, I'm a higher education scholar, which is an interdisciplinary field, and I draw pretty often from sociology and social organizational psych and behavioral economics. So I think what I'm most excited about in this research project is bringing in theories and concepts from social justice education and from public health and literatures that I haven't been in before, to think about how we can engage faculty as bystanders when they see, you know, bias in their everyday interactions, but also thinking about long-term behavior change and how that ties to opportunities for changing in our organizations. You know, I think Rachele and Rodica's research projects really highlight and will really illuminate systems and structures and the kinds of barriers that folks encounter, as well as the pathways that they use. But I also really want to think about other ways that we can engage whole communities and you know, whole campuses and creating structures and systems that better promote equity in STEM. I'm also really eager to, you know, finish this project and then put it into practice. So thinking about, you know, what is part 2 of this bystander intervention program, or part 3, look like on our campus, and you know, how can we kind of translate those lessons learned and help develop them and put them into action in other contexts, whether that be in higher education organizations or elsewhere. And so I am hopeful that we will be able to use this to inform the development of new programs as well.
Thank you. And as we are going into our final prompted question, I want to remind the audience that you can add your questions to the Q&A, and that also we are now turning on the chat if you want to engage a little bit with our team and with each other. But you know, it's hard to get away from this topic. It's already been touched on in your responses today. And, you know, we didn't know whether or not it would be as ever present as it is, but I think there was definitely a shift, specifically with the impacts of Delta variant. And of course, I'm talking about COVID. Could you respond a little bit to, you know, how the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has impacted your research interests and even impacted how you're thinking about the execution of your virtual visiting scholars projects? And I don't know, like, I'm just like, I want to hear from everybody. Don, do you mind starting for us? Because, you know, your program that you work with has been so incredible with supplying resources on some of the many myriad of inequities that have been exacerbated and exposed. So do you mind starting us on this one?
Sure. Well, you know, I would say that broadly, the pandemic and, you know, the clear and pressing concerns about equity for women and BIPOC faculty have kind of renewed my sense of urgency for evidence-informed equity interventions. And not just understanding them conceptually, but putting them into practice, understanding what works and what doesn't and why, and really pushing that information out there so that others can adopt and implement and you know, learn from things that didn't go so well as they're thinking about their own campuses. So, you know, I think all of that is to say, I don't think that the pandemic has really changed my research interest, but it's more, you know, re-energized my commitment and interest in translating out to practice, whether that's on my own campus or on venues like this or in places like Inside Higher Ed. You know, I think that we as a community have a good set of interventions and things that we know that could help. And I think that campuses right now are primed to receive those resources. And so, you know, I think that imperative has just been made more clear over the last 18 months.
Thank you so much. And it everything you said really brought to mind the report that came out fairly early on. And you know, we didn't know that it would have been early on, by Kimberly Griffin and Leslie Gonzalez, who we also hosted for one of our webinars on ensuring equity in COVID-19 institutional responses. And Rodica, something that really comes to mind from our conversation with them and from their report is their focus on needing to better understand the experiences of marginalized folk. Can you speak a little bit to this relationship between, you know, considerations of the pandemic and your research interests?
Yes. Well, you know, I'm teaching full time. I'm teaching full load at our department. So it is affecting me. I know from my experience, like so basically because I teach full time, this is this Visiting Virtual Scholar project is the research project that I'm spending most of my research time on. So which makes it very special for me. And if I had the time, I would definitely focus on already faculty who are struggling and with persisting in their fields, and the pandemic and all the changes that are happening and all the things that faculty need to change at a short notice. Like, for example, on my campus, like there's so many, you never know when things are going to change. So I can see how that affects especially marginalized faculty, because they're already struggling with so many barriers, institutional barriers. These are on top of those. These are additional stressors. So I can see my colleagues, some of my colleagues struggling. I can see the students being more stressed. So these are hard times. And just one example from my personal experiences, even before the pandemic, I had student comments in my evaluations saying that they have their learning processes being hindered because of my accent. And now with a mask on, next week I'm starting to teach face-to-face. I'm thinking about, I have thoughts about whether they will be able to understand me. They will be able to hear me, because we wear masks all the time. So I have thoughts about how will this affect the evaluations this semester. So these are, I'm sharing experiences that are happening right now in the teaching field.
Thank you. And that's such an incredible insight that I think gets overlooked a lot in these conversations where, and I'm speaking more broadly about conversations around what our lecturers, what our instructors and professors are dealing with right now in navigating just a really dynamic landscape, and what it means to try to both keep yourself and your students safe and follow along with the benchmarks of success that you need to hit, which includes the consideration of evaluations. I really appreciate you being open with that, because these are not just the narratives, but the heart and the voice of what we need to hear. You know, when I build on that thought process, there's just all of my brain wires are firing when I think of all the impacts on industry academia and how much people rely on some of these partnerships to, you know, navigate successful career paths for themselves. Rachele, can you speak a little bit to how COVID-19 has impacted how you view your research and your research interests?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, COVID-19 has impacted a lot, you know, within and outside of my research, and that goes for especially women who I think found themselves to be, if they're caretakers, they found themselves to be the default caretakers, and therefore they've had to shoulder not just the burden and stress of navigating equity issues in the workplace, but now also equity issues at home. And then also when you compound that with the fact that the work culture in industry moves a lot faster and more rigorously through, through providing, product development or providing services, the culture is a lot different from academia. And so things move a lot faster. There's less patience for women, especially who might need more time or who need more flexibility. I think COVID creating work from home environments have benefited some women in BIPOC individuals, in the workplace. However, it's added more stress as, working from home, creates, stress just from trying to run a household at the same time, especially if there's children or elderly family members to care for. There's the stress of that. There's the stress of meeting work demands, and then also the stress of navigating workplace biases and gaslighting, things like that. So I think that although we like to, or at least I like to think that progress is a double-edged sword, I think COVID-19 has allowed us as a society to progress more toward, accepting working from home as a solution, versus, creating stress through, commuting or expenses through commuting. But then at the same time, it created another point of inequity, even at home, even when working at home, where, for example, children are more likely to go to mom if they need something or if something's wrong than dad, or the expectations, the gender norms or expectations at home have disproportionately affected women working from home. So, I think that has, I think the biggest or largest impact on my work, particularly for women in BIPOC engaging in industry and academia partnerships, because now there's multiple layers of stress, multiple layers of barriers to navigate. And then, what does that mean? Does that mean that individuals will tap out, of work, meaning that they completely leave the field to focus on things at home because it's just too much? Do they drop down to part-time? Do they go back to academia? Do they leave academia and go only to, work in industry? And what does that mean? So I think, again, just multiple layers of variables now have been added due to COVID. And the impact of those variables may or may not be well captured in the literature through the industry academia partnership lens. But I definitely think it's a research angle that needs to be explored. Because again, it's more complex these days, thanks to COVID. And I'm not sure when that will go away, but I think it's definitely an important focus area for STEM equity work concerning equity in the workplace and equity in the industry workplace, and equity in academia and at home while working from home.
Thank you so much. It's such an important perspective. And I'm so incredibly thankful that we have you all as a part of this program my brain is just running through 1,000 different reasons But most of all, I think it's just that the questions that you're asking, what you're taking time to investigate through this project are so critical right now and so incredibly relevant. When I say that, it comes from a very personal perspective. At this time, we're going to shift for a few minutes to a little bit more of an open Q&A now that we've gotten through our prompted discussion. And our project director, Virginia, and our PI, Heather, are going to kind of help us out for the next, I'd say, 5 minutes, just by asking you a couple more questions. And we'll keep an eye on the Q&A in the chat for additional questions from our audience. So Virginia or Heather, do you have anything that you would love to ask our scholars?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much to all 3 of our scholars for sharing more about your work. And I'm super excited to see where each of your projects are going. Just a question from me. So what challenges do you think you might face going through this research? And I guess we can start with Rachele, since you're the first face I see.
Yeah, no, thank you. So, like I said, the literature around equity and industry academia partnerships is quite scant. And that comes as a surprise to me. It came as a surprise to me as I put my proposal together, and it continues to be a point of confusion for me, because the fact that as industry has played a stronger role in driving academic research, I wondered why it hasn't been the case that we haven't applied very much an equity lens to this particular focus area. Now, there are some institutions that have begun to collect this type of data, like the University of Houston Center for Advancing Faculty Success. They have reported some gender disparity in industry funding for academic research at their institution, academic STEM research at their institution. So few institutions have begun to look at this problem, but in any case, I think what's really compelling, I think, about my research is the fact that I'm trying to sort of level set through a qualitative analysis, a systematic qualitative analysis of the literature to, as I mentioned before, understand some key themes that are being captured by institutions that are collecting this data, and then also what are themes captured in the literature from, say, a storytelling standpoint or a commentary even, so that way we can capture the full range of experiences and then begin to measure that moving forward. And I think that's what's most compelling and as I mentioned, exciting about my work, because it's sort of level setting this particular research focus area, and it's underexplored. There are, I'm sure, lots of literature gaps, as I've started to see already, and I look forward to filling some of those gaps with some qualitative knowledge.
Great, thank you so much, and good luck with your project.
Thank you.
Rodica, same question to you. Do you see any challenges moving forward in your project?
So one thing I noticed, and I don't want to rush into making conclusions because I want to read more studies. One thing I noticed is that the literature on persistence for women of color in STEM is very good. However, I got the sense that the literature about persistence about women of color in non-STEM fields gives a little bit more context to why women are using those strategies. And this kind of, because my focus is on how the women design their strategies in a way to overcome all those barriers at the cultural, departmental level, and the interactions with faculty. And I think that women who are interviewed, women who are in non-STEM, they seem to provide more background of why they're doing what they're doing. And it probably has to do something with people you know, being in social sciences versus STEM. So, but I don't want to make conclusions, but that's what I noticed at this point of time. So I think that, you know, for my meta-ethnography, because I'm looking for context, I'm looking for meaning. What does it mean to persist in an, you know, in hospitable environment, work environment? I think that, like, I need more of that context, like how and why, rather than what the strategies are, if that makes sense. And I think I'm gonna use, you know, because in meta-ethnography, we need the saturation point of, you know, what themes and metaphors are there. So I might use themes from non-STEM literature as well. So that's my thought right now. That I'm wondering, should I go into the non-STEM as well, and, you know, figure out, you know, more metaphors and more context for. So yeah, that's the main dilemma.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. And yeah, that will be interesting to see if you'll need to shift to those non-STEM areas or not, but we'll see moving forward, I guess.
Yes, I will keep going because I have so much literature right now.
It's always good to hear. And Dawn, same question, any challenges do you see moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my challenges are in some ways the opportunities. I mean, what I anticipate is that there will be a lot of conflicting definitions about what it means to be an ally versus a bystander versus an advocate. And in part, one of the reasons why I'm excited about these projects is because I really wanted to tease apart what each of those meant and should mean, and how it therefore translates into faculty development. But I just anticipate that making sense of those definitions from field to field and discipline to discipline is going to be difficult, but I think the big contribution as well.
Yeah, I can definitely see that being an issue with everyone kind of using the terms interchangeably there, but hopefully you'll be able to tease that apart and share that with us at the end.
Thank you so much, Virginia. I'm sorry I turned my mic on at the end of a really deep chuckle. I loved hearing from you all about some of these challenges, in part because a lot of times people don't understand what really goes into these deep dives, even into existing literature, let alone producing new information and new knowledge from new data. So it makes me even more incredibly excited. And I'm so thankful that you all took the time to have this conversation with us. And as we close, I just want to say that we cannot express enough how thrilled we are to have you and to welcome you as a part of the ARC network through the Virtual Visiting Scholars program. We are also so incredibly thankful to our community and attendees for joining us today. I just want to take a moment to share with you that we are also very excited because cohort 3 of the program will be presenting their work this fall. So I have shown you all 4 topics and dates, and we will be sending out registration links when we send out the recording for today's webinar. But we absolutely hope that you will join us, and we always love to share more about what our amazing scholars are doing. They are so critical to who we are as the ARC network and the work that we do, and so we just cannot thank them enough for just being and existing. As we finish out, I just have to ask that you please provide feedback on your experience today. It's so important for us. We do get a lot from the feedback from our community, and the link for our feedback survey is going in the chat, and it should take about 5 minutes. So we very much appreciate you letting us know about your experience today. And I just want to end by thanking everyone for joining us and thanking our speakers for joining us. We have some information for how to find us on the web and on social media. We are on Facebook and Twitter using the handle ARC Equity in STEM. And thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of the week.